On Thanksgiving night in 1990, 16,000 people packed into the Hartford Civic Center to watch what was supposed to be a celebration, a holiday tradition, a night of good, clean family fun where the good guys triumphed over the bad guys and everyone went home happy. What they actually witnessed was something else entirely. They witnessed a company in the middle of a slow motion collapse, a promotion that was hemorrhaging money and stars and credibility, papering over the cracks with a giant plastic egg and a man in a turkey costume. They witnessed a wrestler perform a match less than 24 hours after his own brother died in his father's arms, with no time off, no compassion, nothing. They witnessed an angle built around a real war being fought by real soldiers, that the man at the center of it had to start wearing a bulletproof vest to the ring. And in the middle of all of it, almost as an afterthought, a pale man in a black coat walked through the curtain and quietly changed the industry forever. This is the dark truth behind the 1990 Survivor series. The night the old world of professional wrestling started to die, and nobody in that building wanted to admit it. Because on the surface, everything looked fine, the lights were bright, the stars were smiling, Hulk Hogan flexed for the cameras, but behind that curtain, in the offices and the locker rooms and the quiet corners where the real decisions got made, the World Wrestling Federation was rotting from the inside out. And this one Thanksgiving night captured all of it in a way that no single event before or since ever quite has. Stay with me, because to understand just how bad things had gotten, you need to understand where this company had been and how far it had fallen in a very short amount of time. In the spring of 1990, the World Wrestling Federation stood at what looked like the very top of the mountain. At WrestleMania 6, in front of more than 60,000 fans at the Sky Dome in Toronto, Hulk Hogan did the unthinkable. He handed the championship to the Ultimate Warrior. Cleanly, in the middle of the ring, it was billed as the passing of the torch. The moment when one era ended and another began, the moment when the biggest star of the business had ever produced stepped aside to make room for the future. That was the story they told the public. The real story was uglier, and the cracks started showing almost immediately. Because here's the thing about the Ultimate Warrior, he was a phenomenon. His merchandise flew off the shelves, his entrance, that sprint to the ring, the shaking of the ropes, the wild energy, all of it made kids lose their minds. But being a merchandise machine and being a drawing champion are two completely different things. And the moment the Warrior had that belt around his waist, the difference became painfully, undeniably clear. House show attendance began to slide, not overnight, not in a way that made headlines, but steadily, quietly. The kind of decline that shows up in the ledgers before it shows up in the arenas. Warrior's first major program as champion was against Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig, and Perfect, as talented as he was, had already been beaten cleanly by Hogan in market after market earlier that year. He had already lost at WrestleMania. So the fans looked at this challenger and they didn't buy him as a real threat. The magic wasn't there, the money wasn't there, and Vince McMahon knew it. By the summer of 1990, just a few months after crowning his new champion, McMahon was already quietly making plans to take the belt off the Warrior and put it back on Hogan. Think about that for a second. The torch had barely been passed. The Warrior had been promised a long multi-year run at the top, and already behind his back, the company was plotting his removal. The whole thing had been a mistake, and everyone in a position of power seemed to know it, except the fans, who were still being sold the fantasy every single week. And there's a detail from that WrestleMania 6 night that tells you everything about the poison running through the top of this company. Hogan was supposed to lose cleanly and gracefully, hand over the spotlight, but according to Hogan's own account in his autobiography, the moment the match ended, he saw an opportunity. Instead of quietly leaving, he zipped over to the timekeeper's area. In his own words, this was his chance to steal back everything the Warrior had just taken from him. The new champion's single biggest moment, the crowning achievement of his career, and Hogan could not resist reaching in to make it about himself. As the crowd watched Hogan leave the arena, the spotlight followed him, not the man holding the belt. That is the culture at the top of this promotion in 1990. Even in the act of passing the torch, the old king was reaching back to snatch the flame. And if that is how the biggest star in the business behaved toward his supposed successor, imagine how the machine treated everyone below him. The Warrior never really had a chance. He was set up to inherit a kingdom, while the previous ruler quietly plotted his downfall from the very first day, and the audience, the paying customers, had no idea that the coronation they had cheered was already being planned as a funeral. That is the thing about this company. The performance the fans saw and the reality backstage were two completely different shows, and only one of them was fake. This is the environment the 1990 Survivor Series was born into. A company that had bet everything on a new #1 star and lost that bet almost instantly. A company scrambling for a solution. A company that was, in a very real sense, running out of ideas at the exact moment it could least afford to. And it gets worse, because the problems at the top were only part of the story. The roster itself was starting to come apart at the seams. Consider who was supposed to be on this card and who actually was. Rick Rude, one of the most gifted heels of his entire generation, a man who could talk an audience into a frenzy and back it up in the ring, was originally booked to compete at this very event. He was scheduled to be part of the show, and then he was gone. A contract dispute with Vince McMahon, a falling out over money and direction, and just like that, one of the company's best performers walked out the door. His spot on the card had to be filled at the last minute by Haku. Rude wasn't the only one. Akeem, formerly the One Man Gang, had left the company in October, just weeks before the show. His spot on Sergeant Slaughter's team had to be given to Boris Zhukov, and here's a detail that tells you everything about the state of the World Wrestling Federation's roster planning. In 1990, this was the second Survivor Series in a row where Akeem's spot had to be scrambled and replaced. 2 years running, the plans fell apart around the same slot. These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms. Symptoms of a company where the talent was increasingly unhappy, where the money was starting to feel less secure, where the golden age that had defined the mid-80s was quietly slipping away and being replaced by uncertainty. And it's worth sitting with what the Rick Rude situation in particular represented. Rude was not some replaceable mid-card body. He was one of the most complete performers in the entire company. A man with a gift for making an audience despise him, an incredible physique, and the in-ring ability to back up every arrogant word out of his mouth. He was exactly the kind of talent a healthy company builds its future around, and instead of finding a way to keep him happy, the World Wrestling Federation let him walk over a disagreement about money and creative direction. A promotion that valued its people, that had a functioning long-term vision, does not lose a performer of that caliber weeks before a major show and scramble to plug the hole. The fact that they did tells you the priorities were badly out of order. Rude would surface in the rival promotion soon enough, and he would become an important part of the wrestling war that defined the decade to come. The World Wrestling Federation simply let that value walk out the door. You have to picture the locker room as it actually was in late 1990. Guys who had been there since the boom, watching the crowds thin out just slightly, feeling the ground shift, wondering if the good times were behind them. Wrestlers talk, they compare notes, they know when attendance is down because they can see the empty seats from the ring, and a locker room full of people who suspect the peak has passed is a locker room ripe for defections, for contract holdouts, for the kind of quiet unrest that eventually becomes a full-blown exodus. That unrest was already brewing. The 1990 Survivor Series was standing on top of it. But you'd never have known any of this if you were a fan tuning in, because the World Wrestling Federation was a master of illusion, and their solution to a card full of holes and a company full of problems was to distract everyone with the single most infamous piece of misdirection in the history of the business. They gave the world an egg. For weeks leading up to the Survivor Series, a gigantic egg had been appearing at World Wrestling Federation events all across the country. It sat there on television on a little nest of hay, on a platform covered in question marks. And the announcers hyped it relentlessly. What was inside? Nobody knew. Speculation ran completely wild among the fans. Was it a returning superstar? A brand new debut, a famous world champion jumping ship from another promotion? Was it something bigger than wrestling itself? A dinosaur, a celebrity? The imagination of the audience did all the heavy lifting, and the World Wrestling Federation was happy to let it. The mystery of the egg became one of the most talked about things in wrestling. People genuinely could not wait to find out what was going to hatch out of that thing. The anticipation built and built and built for weeks. This was, by some accounts, the single most anticipated segment of the entire show, more than The Undertaker, more than the main event, Everyone wanted to know what was in the egg. The man tasked with pulling this off was Hector Guerrero, the older brother of the legendary Eddie Guerrero, a genuinely talented, hardworking professional wrestler. And on Thanksgiving Day, he arrived at the arena and was placed inside a box underneath that giant egg. He stayed crammed inside there for something like 4 hours. 4 hours hidden away so that not a single person entering the Hartford Civic Center could catch a glimpse of what was coming and spoil the surprise. 4 hours of a real athlete's life, spent folded up in a box waiting to ruin his own reputation. Because when the moment finally came, when Mean Gene Okerlund stood beside that egg and worked the crowd into a lather, teasing that it could be anything, that the speculating was all over, that the incubation was complete, the egg cracked open and out came the answer. A man in a cheap turkey costume, googly eyes, flapping wings, a garbled, muffled voice. They called it the Gobbledy Gooker, and it danced. It danced around the ring with Mean Gene to the tune of Turkey in the Straw, while Gorilla Monsoon and Roddy Piper tried desperately and failed to inject some enthusiasm into the moment from the commentary booth. The crowd's reaction was one of the most damning sounds in wrestling history: stunned silence. 16,000 people who had built this moment up in their heads for weeks, who had imagined a dinosaur or a superstar or something spectacular, sat there in complete bewildered silence. And then the silence gave way to something worse: boos. A rain of boos coming down on a man in a turkey suit dancing his heart out in the middle of the ring. You have to understand the layers of what makes this so dark. This wasn't just a bad idea, it was a bad idea that consumed weeks of television time. It was a bad idea that took a legitimately skilled wrestler and buried him under a pile of feathers for no discernible reason. Nobody to this day has ever been able to fully explain why the company hired a worker of Hector Guerrero's ability for the sole purpose of stuffing him into a giant turkey outfit. And it was a bad idea born of desperation, because the reason the World Wrestling Federation needed a giant distracting mystery in the first place was that the actual wrestling product was struggling. When your business is healthy, you don't need to spend weeks building to a plastic egg. The egg was a symptom, a big, feathered, googly-eyed symptom of a company that had lost faith in its own core product and was reaching for gimmicks to fill the gap. There's an added layer of cruelty to how the crowd received it, and it connects to that experimental format we'll get to later. Because part of the reason the reaction curdled so fast was fear. In 1990, the company had introduced the idea that the survivors of each match would meet in a grand finale at the end of the night. And as the egg cracked, some fans were seized by a genuine dread that whatever emerged from it might actually be booked to wrestle in that main event alongside Hogan and the Warrior. The thought that this thing, whatever it was, might be a serious part of the show only made the letdown land harder when the answer turned out to be a man in a discount turkey suit. The hope curdled into disappointment, and the disappointment curdled into boos. The Gobbledy Gooker was quietly dropped almost immediately. The character led to nothing. It went nowhere. It became, and remains to this day, a punchline. There's an actual award handed out every year by wrestling fans named after this disaster. The Gooker Award, given to the worst gimmick or worst idea in wrestling for a given year. That is the legacy of that turkey. Decades of shorthand for creative failure. And think about the human cost buried in that punchline. Hector Guerrero came from wrestling royalty. The Guerrero family is one of the most respected bloodlines the business has ever produced. He was a skilled, dedicated professional who had earned the right to be taken seriously. And the defining image of his time in the biggest promotion in the world became a turkey costume and a chorus of boos. He spent 4 hours crammed in a box under a fake egg to protect a surprise that the company then completely wasted. That is what the World Wrestling Federation's creative desperation cost a real person. His talent was treated as disposable, sacrificed to a gimmick that any reasonable observer could have told them was doomed. The Gooker is funny in the abstract. It's a lot less funny when you remember there was a proud, capable athlete inside that suit absorbing the humiliation on the company's behalf. But as embarrassing as the turkey was, it wasn't the darkest thing about this show, not even close. Because while the Gobbledy Gooker was merely stupid, Another part of this event crossed the line into something genuinely troubling, something that put real people in real danger. We need to talk about Sergeant Slaughter. For years, Sergeant Slaughter had been one of the most beloved figures in the entire company, a real American hero, a patriotic drill sergeant who waved the flag and stood for everything the audience was supposed to love. He was so popular, so wholesome, that he had a deal with Hasbro to be featured as a character in the G.I. Joe toy line and cartoon. Children idolized him. He was at one point arguably the second most popular good guy in the whole promotion, trailing only Hogan himself. And then Vince McMahon made a phone call. Slaughter's contract with G.I. Joe was coming to an end, and McMahon had an idea. He wanted to bring Slaughter back to the World Wrestling Federation, but not as the hero. He wanted Sergeant Slaughter, the living embodiment of American patriotism, to become an Iraqi sympathizer. Now, timing is everything, and the timing of this could not possibly have been worse or, from a cold business perspective, more calculated. Because in August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States was mobilizing for war. Operation Desert Shield was underway, and hundreds of thousands of actual American servicemen and women were being deployed to the Gulf, many of them spending that very Thanksgiving away from their families in the desert, preparing to fight and possibly die. And in the middle of that, the World Wrestling Federation decided to run an angle where their new villain praised Saddam Hussein's Iraq and mocked the United States for going soft. Slaughter would appear on television and claim that America had grown weak, that a small nation like Iraq had the strength that America lacked. He aligned himself on screen with General Adnan, a character meant to represent Iraqi interests. This was not a fantasy war between fictional countries. This was a real conflict happening in real time, with real American soldiers in real danger, and the company was using it to sell tickets. The reaction was exactly what you might expect, and then some. Fans didn't take it as entertainment, they took it as an insult, as something close to treason, and the anger didn't stay in the arena. Sergeant Slaughter, the man, Bob Remus, began receiving death threats, real ones, serious enough that he took to wearing a bulletproof vest to the ring. Think about the reality of that for a moment. A professional wrestler, a performer, a man whose actual job was to pretend, felt he needed body armor to safely do that job. Because the line between the character and the man had been completely erased in the minds of enraged fans who believed he had genuinely betrayed his country. Slaughter himself later reflected on why the heat got so real. He performed the role as convincingly and as viciously as he possibly could, and the audience responded to that sincerity by taking it deadly seriously. He committed to the character, and the character's supposed betrayal of America landed like a real one. And it wasn't just Slaughter who caught the danger. Bruce Pritchard, a World Wrestling Federation employee who was involved in building this angle, was awarded a fake medal on television as the greatest American as part of the storyline construction. He too was asked to wear a ballistic vest. He and Slaughter both refused at various points, and Pritchard admitted years later that he had badly underestimated just how seriously the public was taking the whole thing. He had assumed the fans were sophisticated enough to understand it was all a performance. He was wrong. The Gulf War was not the kind of thing a large chunk of the audience was willing to see turned into a wrestling gimmick. At the Survivor Series itself, Slaughter appeared and cut a promo insulting the American servicemen who were stationed in the Gulf, spending their Thanksgiving away from home. On a holiday specifically about family and gratitude and country, the company put a man on pay-per-view to spit on the soldiers who were overseas. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how cynical this was. It was designed from top to bottom to generate the maximum possible outrage, and it succeeded. This entire angle would build towards Slaughter winning the World Championship at the Royal Rumble a couple of months later, and then losing it to a flag-waving Hogan at WrestleMania 7 in what was meant to be a grand patriotic triumph. The whole thing was a piece of business. Human fear, wartime anxiety, genuine grief and anger, all of it converted into ticket sales and pay-per-view buys. That's the dark truth of the Sergeant Slaughter storyline. It wasn't edgy for the sake of art. It was exploitation for the sake of money at the exact moment real families were terrified for their loved ones overseas, and the consequences of that decision rippled outward in ways the company hadn't fully anticipated. When it came time to stage WrestleMania 7 a few months later, the show that was supposed to be the grand payoff to this whole angle, the World Wrestling Federation had originally planned to run it in the massive Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. The dream was to chase the kind of enormous attendance record they had set years earlier, but the combination of the death threats surrounding Slaughter and the heightened security concerns of a nation at war made an open-air stadium of that size a genuine safety problem. There was no way to properly secure it, so the event was quietly moved to the much smaller sports arena nearby, and the company spun a story about ticket demand to cover for it. The angle that was supposed to make them look bold ended up shrinking their biggest show of the year. The exploitation didn't even pay off the way they'd hoped. It just left a mess. And there's a bitter irony baked into the whole thing. The Gulf War ended quickly and decisively. The United States and its allies pushed Iraq out of Kuwait in short order, which meant that Slaughter, the man who had bet his character on Iraq's supposed strength, ended up looking irrelevant, tied to the losing side of a war that was over almost as soon as it started. The angle that had generated so much genuine fear and fury fizzled out, its villain stranded on the wrong side of history, its whole premise overtaken by real events the company couldn't control. They had reached into a live war for heat, and the war didn't cooperate with their storyline. But here's where this story takes its most human, most heartbreaking turn, because the darkest moment of this entire night had nothing to do with turkeys or wars or business decisions. It had to do with a family and a death, and a man who was told to go out and perform anyway. The day before the Survivor Series, on November 21st, 1990, Dean Hart died. Dean was one of the 12 children of the legendary wrestling patriarch Stu Hart. He was the older brother of Bret Hart, the man who was, at that very moment, one of the company's rising stars and one half of the tag team champions, alongside his brother-in-law Jim the Anvil. Dean had been struggling with kidney disease for years, a condition that traced back to a devastating injury he suffered when he was struck by a city bus. Back in 1978, his kidneys never recovered, and on November 21st, at the Hart family home in Calgary, he passed away. He was just 36 years old. He was the first of the Hart children to die young, though tragically, he would not be the last. Bret Hart was shattered. This was his brother, and by his own account, the two of them had grown apart in recent years. Their relationship had frayed, and now Dean was gone, and all the things that could have been said and repaired between them never would be. That kind of grief, layered with regret, is a special kind of pain. And here's the part that stays with you. Bret Hart was never offered any time off. Not by the company, not by Vince McMahon. His brother died on the 21st, and on the 22nd, less than 24 hours later, Bret Hart was in Hartford, Connecticut, lacing up his boots to go out and wrestle in front of 16,000 people. Nobody sat him down and told him to go home and be with his family. Nobody told him the match could wait, that his grief mattered more than a spot on a Thanksgiving card. The show, as they say, had to go on. And so Bret Hart went out there carrying the freshest, rawest kind of loss a person can carry, and he did his job. He and his teammates dedicated the match to Dean, and on commentary, Roddy Piper noted that the bout was being dedicated to Bret's brother, who had just passed. Watch that match back knowing this, and it takes on an almost unbearable weight. Bret Hart was one of the final two men in that elimination match, going toe-to-toe with the $1 Million Man in a genuinely excellent exchange before finally being eliminated. He was out there giving the audience a great performance, and inside, he was a man whose brother's body was barely cold. That is perhaps the single darkest truth of this entire event. Not a bad gimmick, not an offensive angle, but the simple, cold reality of an industry that valued a single night's card over the basic human dignity of a grieving man. An industry where a wrestler was expected to swallow his own tragedy and smile for the crowd because there was money to be made and a show to run. It's a window into the culture of professional wrestling in that era, a culture that chewed people up, that demanded everything and offered very little in return, that treated its performers as commodities first and human beings a distant second. And there is no clearer example of it than Bret Hart, standing in that ring in Hartford less than a day after losing his brother, because nobody in charge thought to give him the time to mourn. Now, with all of that weighing on the show, let's actually walk through what happened inside those ropes. Because even the wrestling itself tells the story of a company in transition, a company caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. The event was built around the 4-on-4 elimination tag matches that had become the Survivor Series signature. But 1990 added a strange new wrinkle. This was the only year they ever tried it. The survivors from each of the individual matches would come together at the very end for one final match, a grand finale splitting into a team of good guys and a team of bad guys for one last elimination, about to close the show. The opening match saw a team led by the Ultimate Warrior teaming with the Legion of Doom and the Texas Tornado take on Mr. Perfect and the 3 members of Demolition. Now here's a detail that speaks to the roster chaos we talked about earlier. Demolition had been one of the most dominant popular tag teams in the company, and here they were, expanded to a trio, reduced to being cannon fodder in the opening match, most of them getting themselves disqualified. A team that had headlined and held gold was now an afterthought. The old guard was being cleared out to make room for whatever came next. Then came the match that history actually remembers, the one moment from this entire troubled night that turned out to matter. Ted, the $1 Million Man, had been teasing a mystery partner. He assembled his team with Rhythm and Blues, that's Greg Valentine and the Honky Tonk Man, and then he introduced the man nobody had seen before, led to the ring by the manager Brother Love, weighing in at a legitimate 328 pounds from Death Valley, The Undertaker. He came through the curtain in a long black coat and a wide black hat, looking like a mortician who had wandered out of an old Western horror film. Gorilla Monsoon and Roddy Piper, on commentary, were genuinely taken aback by his size and his presence, and then he got in the ring and did something that no one had really seen before. He felt nothing. His opponents hit him and he simply did not react. No selling, no wincing, no acknowledgement that he could feel pain at all. He moved with an eerie, deliberate calm, and he was shockingly agile and quick for such an enormous man. Within about a minute of entering, he took Coco Beware and dropped him with a tombstone piledriver, a maneuver that looked genuinely dangerous, genuinely different from everything else on the card. He eliminated Coco. Later, he eliminated Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream himself, before eventually getting counted out of the match. The man under the coat and hat was Mark Calloway. He had spent time in other promotions, wrestling as Mean Mark Callis in World Championship Wrestling, where when his contract came up, the company decided he wasn't worth renewing. They let him go. They looked at Mark Calloway and saw a big man with limited upside. Vince McMahon looked at the same man and saw something nobody else had seen. He saw a character, a dead man, a supernatural force, and the concept of The Undertaker was presented to Calloway only after he had already signed on. Consider how close this character came to never existing at all. Another company had looked at this exact man and shrugged. They saw a large, athletic heavyweight and decided he was not worth the money to keep around. In the wrestling business of that era, that was practically a death sentence for a career. Plenty of talented people washed out of the industry after a rejection like that, drifting off to the independent circuit or out of wrestling entirely. Mark Calloway could very easily have been one of them, a footnote, a big man who didn't quite make it, and instead he landed in a company that was so creatively adrift, so willing to throw ideas at the wall, that it happened to throw the right one. The Undertaker concept was strange, a silent funereal figure who felt no pain and moved like a phantom. It was the kind of high concept swing that a more cautious, more successful company might never have taken. In a weird way, the World Wrestling Federation's very instability, its desperation to find something new that would work, created the conditions for its greatest long-term success. They needed a miracle, and by sheer force of trying everything, they stumbled into one. And the no selling, the refusal to react to pain, was more than a neat trick. It was the entire foundation of the character's mystique. Every other wrestler on that card operated by the normal rules. You hit them, they hurt, they sold it. The crowd felt the drama of a man in pain fighting back. The Undertaker rewrote those rules on his very first night. You hit him and nothing happened. he just kept coming, slow and inexorable, like something that could not be reasoned with or stopped. That single choice made in that first match established him as a force rather than a man. It's the reason he could remain compelling for 30 years while trends and eras and entire wrestling companies came and went around him. That gamble, made by a company drowning in bad decisions and worse ideas, turned out to be the one thing they got completely right. The Undertaker would go on to a career spanning 3 full decades. He would win the World Championship at the very next Survivor Series a year later by beating Hulk Hogan. He would compile the most famous undefeated streak in the history of WrestleMania. He would become one of the most beloved and enduring characters the industry ever produced. And it all started here on this dark, strange, troubled night, almost buried beneath a dancing turkey and a wartime propaganda angle. There's something poetic about that. The single most valuable thing the World Wrestling Federation created in 1990 made its debut on the same show as the single most embarrassing. The future of the company walked to the ring on the same night. And the company's worst instincts were on full display. Life and death right next to each other, the way they so often are. The night rolled on. There was a match involving Sergeant Slaughter and his team of foreign menaces, the Mercenaries, going up against a team that included Tito Santana, Nikolai Volkov, and the Bushwhackers. Critics have generally regarded this as the low point of the in-ring action, a clunky, forgettable affair weighed down by the ugliness of the angle surrounding it. There was the match featuring Jake the Snake Roberts leading a team called the Vipers against Rick Martel and his team, the Visionaries. And this was fueled by one of the more genuinely compelling feuds of the period. Martel had blinded Jake Roberts by spraying his cologne, Arrogance, directly into Jake's eyes. Roberts spent this whole period selling the idea that his vision was still impaired, that he was fighting at a genuine disadvantage, driven by the need for revenge. It was good, dramatic storytelling, and in a moment that had never happened before in Survivor Series history, Martel's entire team survived completely intact, a booking choice made specifically to stack the deck for that experimental grand finale match at the end of the night. And then came the finale itself. The survivors gathered together on the side of good, Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, and Tito Santana. On the side of evil, the $1 Million Man and the 4 Visionaries. It was an imbalanced, awkward match by design, and it ended the way almost everything in the World Wrestling Federation ended in this era, with Hulk Hogan standing tall, Hogan pinned Ted, and he and the Warrior posed for the crowd as the show went off the air. Even here, at the very end, you can see the company's central problem laid bare. They had just spent an entire night showcasing the debut of The Undertaker, planting seeds for the future, and yet the show still had to close with Hogan and Warrior flexing, the 2 stars whose acts were, respectively, going stale and quietly failing. The company could not help itself. It kept reaching backward to the safety of Hogan, even as the ground was shifting beneath its feet. Because that's what this whole event really was, when you strip away the spectacle. It was a company clinging to a formula that was starting to fail, terrified to let go, papering over its fears, with turkeys and war angles and the same 2 muscle-bound heroes it had been leaning on for years. And the truly dark part, the part that gives this whole night its ominous quality in hindsight, is what was coming. Because the problems of 1990 were nothing compared to what was waiting just around the corner. Remember the physiques, the impossibly large chiseled bodies that defined this entire era, Hogan's 24-inch pythons, the Warrior's absurd muscle mass. The ultimate challenge at WrestleMania had been sold in part on the spectacle of these 2 cartoonishly huge men. That look, that aesthetic, was about to become the company's greatest liability, because in the background, largely unknown to the public in November of 1990, a legal storm was gathering. A physician named George Zahorian, who had worked as a ringside doctor at World Wrestling Federation events in Pennsylvania, had been distributing steroids to the talent. Within months of this Survivor Series, Zahorian would be facing federal charges and a conviction for illegally distributing drugs, and his testimony would name names. It would confirm what many had suspected, that the Incredible Bodies fans were cheering were, in many cases, chemically enhanced. That scandal would explode across 1991 and 1992. It would drag Hulk Hogan onto a late-night talk show to give an embarrassing, damage-controlling non-answer about his own use a public relations disaster that damaged his image. It would put Vince McMahon himself in a federal courtroom fighting for the very survival of his company. And it would combine with a wave of other allegations to create the single darkest period in the company's history. To that point, the stars would flee. Over the next couple of years, the roster would empty out, Hogan would step away, the Warrior would be gone. The whole glittering machine that seemed so unstoppable would sputter and nearly it stops looking like just a mediocre wrestling show with a silly turkey. It starts looking like a snapshot. A perfectly preserved moment capturing a company at the exact instant the good times started to end. Every element of it, the failing champion, the departing stars, the desperate gimmicks, the exploitative angles, the callous treatment of a grieving man, and the looming shadow of a scandal that would nearly bring the whole thing down, all of it was right there on that one Thanksgiving night. You just had to know where to look. The fans in that arena didn't know. They saw the bright lights and the big stars and the dancing turkey, and most of them went home having had a perfectly fine time, unaware of the rot underneath. That's the nature of this business. The illusion is the product. The smile hides the pain. The show goes on no matter what is happening backstage, no matter who is grieving, no matter what is falling apart. But the truth was always there in the empty seats that were starting to appear at house shows, in the contract disputes driving talent out the door, in the death threats that had a performer wearing body armor to a wrestling ring, in the young man wrestling less than a day after his brother's death because no one gave him permission to grieve, and in the quiet, ominous debut of a man dressed as death itself, walking to the ring as the era around him began to crumble. The 1990 Survivor Series has been remembered for the most part as a lesser show, a footnote, the one with the turkey, the one where the Undertaker debuted, but it deserves to be remembered as something more than that. It deserves to be remembered as the night the mask slipped. The night when, if you look past the spectacle, you could see exactly what professional wrestling really was at the dawn of the 1990s. A business that would do almost anything, exploit almost anything, ignore almost any human cost to keep the lights on and the turnstiles spinning. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all. Not any single incident, not the turkey or the war angle or the grief, but the machine itself. The relentless, uncaring machine that treated tragedy and triumph as just more content to be packaged and sold. A machine that could give us the Undertaker and the Gobbledy Gooker on the very same night and never so much as blink at the difference. The people in that building on Thanksgiving night in 1990 thought they were watching a wrestling show. In reality, they were watching the end of an era, the exploitation of a war, and the debut of a legend, all wrapped together in one strange, unforgettable evening. They just didn't know it yet, but now you do, and the next time you see a clip of that turkey dancing in the ring or the Undertaker making his eerie first walk to the ring, remember everything that was really happening behind that curtain. Remember the grief, the fear, the desperation, and the cold calculation. Remember that in professional wrestling, the darkest stories are almost never the ones they put on the poster. They're the ones they hope you never find out about. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of professional wrestling, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that pull back the curtain on the moments the industry would rather you forget. Until next time.